Welcome to Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. Today we'll look at one subject in the news, or one subject that many would hope isn't in the news, but still persists. It's a story that has legs, perhaps because much of it was broken on the Internet, which is a free form of publication. I'm talking about the Contra-cocaine South Central Los Angeles story. Today we'll be joined by Harlan Braun, who's a prominent local Los Angeles defense attorney, and he'll be talking about his clients, and they were key to this story. A group of Los Angeles County Sheriff's officers were arrested for skimming drug profits from confiscated raids. They also took part in a raid in 1986 on homes of members of an alleged drug dealing ring that included Danilo Blandon. State Senator Tom Hayden has written a letter to Sherman Block, the sheriff of Los Angeles. In this letter, he's asked, and this letter is dated December the 3rd, so he's expecting, Senator Hayden's expecting a reply next week from Sherman Block. But however, the sheriff, after having said that there were no papers associated with this raid available, have now reinvestigated this 1986 raid and have turned up 3,500 pages. And quoting from Senator Hayden's letter, in light of previous statements that no records were recovered from the raid and a general public suspicion regarding this saga, these documents may reveal answers to troublesome questions that will not go away. So we'll be looking into those troublesome questions. We'll also be joined by Robert Parry, who is the editor of the Consortium for Independent Journalism. He was the reporter originally when he was working for the Associated Press, AP. He broke the Iran Contra story, and much of this story that has persisted in terms of the connection between South Central Los Angeles and the Contras, and under the broad heading of CIA and drugs, which will be the subject for today. Let's now go to Harlan Braun. I'm speaking with Harlan Braun, who's a prominent Los Angeles defense attorney, and back in 1986, Harlan Braun, there was a raid conducted by the Majors 2 unit of the L.A. Sheriff's Office, and you handled the subsequent trial of the defendants. Tell me how the case came to you.
Well, my particular client was a deputy sheriff that guarded me when I was a prosecutor in one of some of the Manson family when I was a young prosecutor, so he came to me. I figured I owed him a defense. But what happened was that the sheriffs basically were systematically stealing money from drug dealers, and they finally got caught by a federal sting.
I see. But it turned out that when the defendant, Daniel Garner, came to you, did he not say that it's okay, we've got a airtight defense system?
Yeah, not only Dan Garner, but all the sheriffs assumed that the federal government wouldn't come after him for these relatively minor thefts because they had uncovered the connection between the drug traffickers and the CIA in the 1986 search.
I see. So essentially, they felt that they had immunity.
Right, I think naively so. I mean, even though they were experienced police officers, they just didn't understand that the federal government, one arm can do one thing and another arm won't know about it or just simply deny it. So they just thought that they had them in a box, which they obviously did not.
But out of that raid, the sheriffs did copy some of these seized documents at the homes of Danilo Blandon, who is a major figure in the story that was broken by the San Jose Mercury News and has subsequently been covered by other.
Well, they understood the significance of it immediately, and they had the foresight to copy some of the documents because shortly after the raid, everything was taken away by some federal officers who showed up at the sheriff's station. But they did maintain these documents, and they thought these would be almost give immunity for subsequent prosecution.
These 10 pages that we're referring to now, you gave copies to. What happened? The L.A. Times got a report.
What happened was that I tried to go public with the idea that of this CIA drug connection as part of a defense. The prosecution, the U.S. government, I asked them for a letter saying it did not occur, and then I would put an end to it. They simply asked for an order to gag me. I put the documents into the court under seal, and I gave a copy to the L.A. Times, hoping that they would work on it. They never did anything with it. 5 of the pages disappeared, ironically, but have subsequently been recovered by the Sheriff's Department. Those are the direct papers from Lister listing various CIA agents and connections.
Now, Lister was one of the people raided in this by this unit, Majors 2 unit of the Sheriff's Department, in conjunction with the Nicaraguan drug dealer Camilo Blandon. Lister is a retired Laguna Beach burglary detective.
He identified himself to the sheriffs as a CIA operative. They allowed him to call to it in. They recovered a number of documents that would indicate that. In fact, the directions to the sheriffs, even before they met Lister, said that this was a Contra operation, bringing drugs in order to raise money for the war in Nicaragua. There was no question about what was going on, and the sheriffs knew it, and the FBI was part of the 86 raid. So I don't know why people are also surprised about this connection.
Well, I believe that the FBI documents concerning that 1986 raid were the first break that the reporter from the San Jose Mercury News, Gary Webb, got when he did a Freedom of Information search.
Wow, so that they finally dug it up. Yeah, that's,
right.
You know, it's interesting because when you listen to the denials right now, I mean, you have to listen very carefully to what's being said, and the denials. And I'm not an activist in this area. I just got in it. Once the case was over, I got out of it, and then just was dug up by various reporters. My involvement. You listen to the denials; they're very carefully couched. Like the CIA Inspector General say, we do not have any evidence that any CIA agents were directly involved with drug dealing. Well, that, of course, is an admission, because what they're simply saying is what happened, of course, is pretty clear, is you had Contras begin to deal in drugs in order to circumvent the ban on money. You had CIA agents knowing about it, looking the other way, or perhaps, assisting them indirectly. That's really the issue. I don't think anyone thinks that in Washington there was a decision made to sacrifice South Central L.A. to save Nicaragua. The question was, like Watergate, did you get sucked in afterwards in either a cover-up or aiding them? And I think it's pretty clear it occurred.
Indeed, in the meeting in Watts recently, where the now departing Director of Central Intelligence, John Deutsch, in making that statement, there was actually a preface. He said, "At this time, there is no evidence."
Right,
so it was even more circumspect than the way you have related.
You were dealing with some other agency, but this is called the Central Intelligence Agency. They're supposed to keep track of what's going on in the entire world and behind what was then the Iron Curtain. And we're only asking them what was going on in your own agency. So it should not be it should not take weeks to figure out what they were doing. Well, so, I mean, obviously, and I understand there's a reluctance to admit now in 1996 what occurred in 86. But why don't they just say yes? It was a Cold War. We were fighting it. We made some decisions, and we allowed some of our allies to deal in drugs, and we made a decision. We wanted to win the Cold War. It's a tough world out there. We did win the Cold War. Hey, we used Nazi rocket scientists to fight the Cold War right after World War II. No one denies that now. And those decisions were made. No one says we shouldn't have brought Wernher von Braun over here and let him go to the Russians. The decisions are made in war, cold or hot, and people just admit it and get on with it.
Let me just remind the audience again, if I may. I'm speaking with Harlan Braun, who is a prominent Los Angeles defense attorney who handled a case involving a group of L.A. sheriff's officers known as Majors 2. They were a anti-narcotics squad, and they raided a series of homes in Los Angeles in 1986 where a lot of material relating to the Contras was found. They approached the main defendant, Daniel Garner, the sheriff's deputy, approached you, Harlan Braun, to defend him, and basically saying, look, we're okay. The CIA is involved, and that proved to be naive on his part. 10 pages, however, he had the presence of mind to copy some of this confiscated material. And this 10 pages, you turned it over, Harlan Braun, you turned over to Judge Edward Rafidi.
Right.
You also turned over the same 10 pages to a Los Angeles Times reporter, Victor Marina.
Right.
And now we get to a new stage in this story, which is one of the reasons I'm talking to you, Harlan, is I have a letter here from State Senator Tom Hayden to Sherman Block, the sheriff of the county of Los Angeles, dated December the 3rd. And in this letter, Tom Hayden says, I was pleased to see your recent statement that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is reinvestigating the 1986 raid by an anti-drug unit on the homes of members of an alleged drug dealing ring that included Camilo Blandon. I am concerned, however, that the interested public is being refused access to some 3,500 pages of information that you have announced you are forwarding to congressional investigator. I urge you to disclose these 3,500 pages to the public in an accessible way. Now, how come...
Well, let me see what concerns me. Actually, 5 of those pages are most critical that I know about. The 5 pages that were missing, those are the written pages from Lister showing, actually they mentioned Iran, they mentioned a number of things, have been recovered. Copies have been recovered by the Sheriff's Department. They've been shown to my client, who identified them as the same documents, and they're now in that packet given to the federal government. Now, they're either fakes or they're genuine. In other words, it's possible that the guy like Lister tries to disguise himself as a CIA agent or work with the CIA and be a dope dealer on the side and use documents like this to try to protect himself, or they're genuine. It should be easy to determine, very quickly. Now, the fact that they're being withheld now, when they've been talked about so publicly, indicates to me that they may very well be genuine, and that this does show a link that actually may involve Iran too.
Mm. Well, now your client Daniel Gardner, he was shown these papers that resurfaced stuff. Initially, the Sheriff's Department said that they had no record of this, and then Congresswoman Maxine Waters went down to the sheriff's office and demanded the release of papers.
Right. Now they didn't have those, but now they do have them. Now I suspect that where they came from is that some of the other sheriffs, in addition to Garner, had kept copies of these same documents for the same reason that Garner did, thinking it was insulation from a prosecution, and they then turned them over to these copies over to these sheriff's investigators. But now they're critical to get at them. If they're fakes, let's expose them as fakes, and if they're genuine, let's know what's going on. Now, there's another issue. My clients seized about $60 million worth of drug money here in Los Angeles in a relatively short period of time. That money was turned over to the federal government, and the testimony at the trial was that the money was wired out back to the drug cartel. As I told the House investigators, all we have to do is to trace that money. If that money went to the U.S. Treasury, there is no problem, because that's where that money should have gone. If that $60 million went somewhere else, the question is why? Why is it going to the drug cartel, or why is it going to offshore banks, or why is it buying guns in Europe? So it's a very simple thing. Follow the money, and they refuse to do that. That particular story about where the money went may actually be more important than this CIA drug connection, because what may have happened is not the CIA, but the main federal government was involved in drug trafficking here, using that money for other purposes.
Well, it's also worth noting, Harlan Braun, that Freeway Rick Ross, whose trial to some extent brought this story out, he continued dealing for many years after Blandon was arrested, or his house was raided in this 1986 raid. Right. And he was Blandon apparently was his main supplier.
Well, what happens, of course, is you see the feds, the federal agencies, and the local sheriffs were grabbing money in order to confiscate it, to use it for their own purposes, particularly the federal government. This was like off-the-books money. And what happens, of course, if you have a successful 1 year, you've wiped out the drug dealers, haven't you? The only way, you're almost like a herdsman culling a herd. The only way to really make money is to only take down so much of the money and allow the other drug dealing to continue, because that's what generates the money. I think what happened is that this forfeiture laws degenerated into actual participation by the U.S. government and local officials in drug dealing, in the sense that they had to allow the drugs to come in to generate the money. They had to allow a certain number of the dealers to operate. They wouldn't take down the money couriers. Now, you understand that in the $60 million that my client seized and the hundreds of money couriers that they intercepted, they never arrested one drug courier. Now, that is undisputed. They were under orders that if the drug courier would sign a piece of paper saying that this is not my money, they were to be released. Now, what do you think happened? What do you think the drug dealers thought when these couriers were showing up without $60 million? See, so there was something very nefarious here going on. Either there was a unspoken alliance between the U.S. government and law enforcement and the drug dealers that, you know, we let you operate so we can make money, or there was a express deal. Now, where did that $60 million go, and why weren't these money couriers all arrested? Those are very simple questions, and the answer to that an honest answer will give us a definition of what was going on here 10 years ago.
But Harlan Braun, you're a fairly experienced defense attorney. You were involved with the Rodney King case. You turned down the O.J. Simpson case. You know your way around. I mean, would you be comfortable having all of these documents that have resurfaced that originally were not supposed to exist? Now there's 3,500 pages involved. Are you comfortable them going to the House investigators, given that the chairman of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, Larry Combast, he just, along with the CIA, they just stripped a State Department officer of his security clearances because he told the truth to the Congress. So here you have the head of the Congressional Committee punishing a government official for telling the truth to the Congress. So, as far as I'm concerned,
I'm sort of a cynical person. I mean, in a sense, look, it took 5 years for the veterans, white veterans, basically, or at least a number of white veterans and powerful conservative groups, to dig out of the government the fact that there was a huge amount of physical injuries done to the troops in the Iraqi war. It took 5 years with tremendous conservative pressure. Now, what's the chance that Maxine Waters and the African-American activists in South Central LA will able to dig this out of the federal government? Probably close to zero, because though it happened, it's not really in the government's interest to admit that it happened. I mean, someone should make a decision that maybe it's better just to let it come out all at once and get it over with than to let this thing drip, drip, drip for the next 10 years. But, you know, given the government's pattern, I think they will probably go into their denial mode. And, of course, the problem they have is, like, look at these 5 pages we're talking about. There is another couple sheriffs out there that probably have copies of them. So if they don't make them public, they're going to get public anyway. Mm-hmm. So I just haven't, we'll just have to see how, the way it works itself out.
And these 5 pages in this 10 pages that you have seen and that your client, Daniel Garner, was recently shown in order to verify that they were the same as the original 10. They include diagrams of the routes of the drug money, the laundering process outside the United States. I'm just quoting here from Senator Hayden's letter of December the 3rd to Sherman Block, the sheriff of the county of Los Angeles. And Senator Hayden told me that he expects a reply this week from Sherman Block.
Let's see the documents. I mean, look, what's the problem? They're either genuine or they're fakes. Let's find out. I mean, I've seen the documents. I can't swear that they're genuine because you have to know the background, who the names belong to verify them, or they're fakes. They're Lister trying to use some guise of being a CIA operative in order to protect his drug dealing. Right. Either way, it's a simple determination. Let's find out whether they're fakes or not. If they're fakes, then there's a whole different cast. If they're not fakes, then there's a direct CIA drug link.
Mm-hmm. And were any of these the documents that you saw, Harlan Braun, were they stamped secret or?
No. These were, remember, half of them were the 5 pages were the pages that did not disappear from Judge Rafiti's court. They were the operative directions for the search warrant, which the Sheriff's Department in '86 said this is the Contras bringing drugs in to support the war. And that there was an FBI who participated in these raids. The other 5 pages were the missing ones, which have now been recovered, which were handwritten documents recovered from Lister.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have any idea what the 3,500 pages are?
No, I mean, probably most of it's garbage if I know the Sheriff's Department, but, there may be 300-400 pages, interesting pages. Mm. They just probably threw everything but the kitchen sink in there.
Right. But the bottom line is that these pages are it is the intention as of this moment that the sheriff will send these on to the congressional investigators, which I understand isn't that the House Select Committee on Intelligence?
I think so. I'd heard the sheriffs asked my client to keep it secret that these documents were recovered, and he said, "Well, I at least have to tell my lawyer," and so they asked him to keep it secret for a week. So, he told me, and we basically kept it secret for a week. But I alerted the investigators who I had met with, who seemed to be 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, that came to my office to question me about this link. I alerted them sort of secretly because I wanted to make sure that they knew the documents were coming and they didn't disappear. Mm-hmm. But other than that, it wasn't made public.
With these investigators, though, there are 3 investigations. This
was the Select House Committee on Intelligence. There was 4 investigators. I think they're all lawyers.
So it's not Bromwich of the.
I don't know. I mean, they were. I don't have them in my office right now, but they gave me their cards. But there's 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They work for the House Select Committee.
Right, and as I pointed out,
they were working out of Julian Dixon's office.
Right.
So it's hard to imagine.
No, but there is also a Justice Department investigation headed up by Bromwich.
Oh, yeah, I don't think that would be probably useless. I mean, in 1990, I gave this stuff. This stuff was available to the U.S. Attorney's Office here. I specifically asked them just to write me a letter, 1-page letter, saying that there's no connection, and they refused to do it, and they basically were part of the cover-up. So the Justice Department is particularly useless. Mm-hmm. They also have the problem they're sending kids to prison for life for small amounts of crack cocaine. So for them to come in and now admit that the U.S. government was involved in the very drug trafficking that they are maintaining this moralistic position is somewhat inconsistent.
Well, what do you expect, since you've clearly you're a little cynical about matters?
It may drip. I mean, it would almost be a miracle if the government would just come out and tell the truth and we'll get it over with. That's fairly inconsistent with their pattern. So I think it'll probably happen. It'll take us several years for the thing to be finally drug out. And the problem, of course, just like the O.J. case, this thing is doing horrendous damage to the race relations in this country, because the reluctance of the government and this mealy-mouthed approach is just exacerbating. I mean, if they would just come and take a look at this is what happened in 1986. The Contras got involved in drug trafficking. We had CIA agents either looking the other way or assisting it. The truth is that the CIA or contra-drug connection it was a minuscule amount of the crack that was coming in. I mean, and it did not cause the crack epidemic. It would have happened anyway. It was a small part of it, but their failure to admit it is making it seem as if they started it and were the major portion of it. Mm. So with the damage that's being done to the government's credibility right now is worse than the damage that would be done by admitting the truth. But who in the government ever has the courage to make that decision?
But what is your, just as an observer, Harlan Braun, what's your sense of the reaction in the press
Oh, it's been very interesting, because it's almost as if the Washington Post was a running dog for the CIA. The L.A. Times tried to do a cover story poo-pooing the San Jose. But if you read the L.A. Times story very carefully, again, it was just like the CIA denials. They kept misphrasing the issue. The issue isn't whether the CIA in Washington decided to bring drugs in from Nicaragua or from Central America into L.A. The issue is whether did the Contras begin to do it, and did the CIA look the other way or condone it? And they will not answer that question, because you can't answer it. The only answer is, of course, it occurred. So the Times, I think, is embarrassed by the fact they had the story in 1990 and blew it, and then they're embarrassed by the fact that the San Jose paper was the one who broke it. So the L.A. story was almost like an attack on the San Jose paper rather than an investigation into the truth.
But did for example, since you are the attorney for the sheriffs involved in this raid, that
he never even came out and talked to me. I mean, it was interesting.
Really?
The reporter, I never talked to any of the reporters that did that story. One of the local guys called me and asked me whether Dan Garner would be available, which he couldn't be right now, but none of them came out to try to track it down at all. It was almost like they were afraid. And you notice, nowhere in the story does it say that I gave these to Judge Feedy and to one of their own reporters. Does it? I mean, you would think that they, at least would admit it.
And these documents you gave were not classified documents. So there's
no. They were the 5 pages were the commands to the sheriffs in 1986, of which there is no question of the authenticity, and it shows exactly what the sheriffs knew in 1986, which was this is the Contras bringing drugs in to support the war in Nicaragua, and that the FBI is party to those raids. So those themselves are actually the most devastating documents.
And these are search warrant documents.
Yeah.
So in other words,
so there's not even a question of their authenticity. That's why the Lister handwritten documents, which have just been recovered, are actually, could be some question about their authenticity. But the papers that are in existence have always shown that the sheriffs and the FBI in '86 knew that the Contras were bringing drugs into here.
They knew it, and they put it in the search warrant.
That's right.
To justify the
under
search.
oath.
Right. Well, Harlan Braun, I thank you very much for joining us. And as I say, I have this letter here, a copy of this letter dated December the 3rd last week to Sherman Block by Senator Tom Hayden, asking for these 3,500 pages to be released to the public.
Senator Hayden is the one who got me involved in this. Apparently, one of the more obscure newspaper articles from 1990 used my name about the CIA, and then he dug that out. I know some of his research people, and then I was able to pull the motion off of my computer because and that's how we started to dig. That's how I had almost forgotten about it. I just, once the case was over, I went on to another case. I'm not really a political activist in any sense.
Right. Well, I thank you very much because, as I say, this is a story that is not going away, and I think there appears to me to be a lot of people that like it to go away.
I think so. Yeah, it's very embarrassing. I mean, it's sort of it's like I sort of analogize. It's like the Nazi stories after World War II, where we made particular decisions about using Nazis for our own purposes, and we took years to admit it. And in a way, the government was at a war. And I don't really have any huge disagreement. I mean, if they would just come out and said, "Hey, look, guys, we were fighting for our lives as we perceived it. We thought we were losing Central America, and we made decisions to use drugs to fight communists." I mean, I'm not the person. I'm not going to go crazy over that. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to second guess people 10 years later.
Right. Well, it's just that 10 years later we have a crack epidemic, and the Sandinistas are.
But you see, the interesting thing is that's the other thing is that I don't think this caused the crack epidemic. No. That belief is only a result of the government's sort of disinformation that they're now trying to put out, which then allows the most wild speculation to gain credence. So the government's really doing itself a disservice with this kind of dishonesty.
Once again, I thank you for joining us in Los Angeles.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye. Hello again, I'm Ian Masters, and I was just speaking then with Harlan Braun, who's a prominent Los Angeles defense attorney, and he was the attorney for the sheriffs, the leader of the sheriffs group that raided these houses back in 1986 that uncovered these documents. And as he mentioned, he handed over copies to a federal judge and to the Los Angeles Times back in 1990. And this case has been reinvestigated by Sheriff Sherman Block. And on December the 3rd of last week, Senator Tom Hayden sent a letter to Sherman Block asking that these 3,500 pages that have resurfaced in this new investigation be handed over to the public rather than sent on to Washington to the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I'm now speaking with Robert Parry, who is the editor of the Consortium for Independent Journalism, and he's formerly a reporter with the Associated Press, and then you went on to Newsweek, and you're also the head of the Nation's investigative team. Robert, you didn't have the benefit of listening to Harlan Braun, but essentially he's sort of perplexed that this story has been sitting around since 1990, and since it's been revisited since the Gary Webb articles, still nobody has talked to him. What's your sense on this disconnect between the internet, between this reporter up in San Jose, who broke this story and the rest of the media that seemed to be quite hostile towards her?
Well, I think it goes back. There's a history to this story, like there often is. And in a way, you have to go back to the beginning of the 1980s when the Reagan administration made such an effort on behalf of the Contras, the Nicaraguan Contras, and in the effort to overthrow the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. And as the Reagan administration internally described it, we now have their documents on some of their what they call public diplomacy. The idea was to glue white hats on the Contras and to glue black hats on the Sandinistas through kind of public relations techniques. So whenever the Contras would come under scrutiny for human rights violations or any kinds of political problems, the Reagan administration would try to clean them up, discredit the witnesses, attack the reporters who might be digging out the stories, try to intimidate Congress if they were looking into these areas. And that became the name of the game. So when the contra-drug story first came onto the scene in December of '85, when Brian Barger and I wrote the piece for the Associated Press, that was the way the Reagan administration responded. It was trying to, at that point, get more money for the Contras, more military aid. The CIA had been stopped by Congress from being involved with the Contras for a year or two at that point, and the Reagan administration wanted to bring the CIA back in. If you remember, Oliver North was sort of running the program in the interim. So the idea was, how can you discredit these allegations? It was the idea should have been, I think, how can you stop these crimes from going forward? That is, the importation of cocaine into the United States. But instead, the Reagan administration thought it was most important to just stop the story in its tracks. So there were a number of lies told then. There were efforts to discredit Senator John Kerry when he tried to investigate this issue in '86, and as he continued his efforts through the spring of '89, he was under constant criticism. During much of this period, the Washington Press Corps, having been bludgeoned over the Contras for a number of years, swung more and more into line with the Reagan administration position. The Washington Post and the New York Times joined the editorial support for the Contras by the mid to late '80s, and we saw a consensus build in Washington for the Contras, even as the evidence of serious criminal wrongdoing was coming out. And of course, the Iran Contra scandal breaks in the fall of '86, and many of those problems, arms export control violations, obstruction of justice, and so forth, became known in a certain way through the hearings and investigations, but always there was the effort to contain the damage, to protect the Contras. So Washington has sort of dealt with this issue. It's been a very bitter, almost personal controversy inside the Beltway for a decade now. And the people who won that battle were the people who wanted to protect the Contras, who went along with the PR schemes. The reporters and investigators who tried to tell the truth were largely pushed aside, discredited. They lost jobs, and they've been subjected to a lot of ridicule. So that was where the game ended, really, let's say after the Noriega trial, where more of this even came out, but was still basically ignored by the Washington Press Corps. Then Gary Webb and the San Jose Mercury News come bouncing along in 1996 and put this story out about the effects of the contra-drug trafficking, or at least some of the effects of contra-drug trafficking in Los Angeles. And they put the information out on the internet, which is considered kind of a challenge to the Washington news media for dominance of what is to be believed in this country. So it had many red flags attached to it, and the Washington news media, first of all, tried to ignore it. They just disdained the story. But then, after that didn't work, and the black community was very engaged and very upset, and there was a controversy building around the story itself, then the Washington news media, first the Washington Post and the New York Times and the LA Times, the big media, just landed on it, attacked it, blasted it out of the water, if you will, tried to find anything wrong with it they could to discredit the larger question, which was that the Contras had been involved in drug trafficking substantially, and the Washington news media had failed in its responsibility to the American people to warn them of that kind of problem. That is something the Washington Press Corps doesn't want to admit. any more than the government wants to admit that it had tolerated drug trafficking by people tied to the Contra movement.
Well, Robert Parry, but let's just try and figure out what's going on here. Since when has the press been flax for the government, and why is there this? If I'm to accept what you're saying, why is this confluence of interest between a government that may be embarrassed by its actions and a press what's the complicity here? What are they getting out of it?
Well, basically, the reporters who moved ahead, who got the good jobs, were now the bureau chiefs in Washington or the deputy managing editors. Those mid-level news executives got to where they got by ignoring and putting down this story in the 80s. The reporters who looked at it, tried to examine it honestly, were punished and pushed out. There was a tremendous amount of pressure brought to bear on the Washington Press Corps in the 80s not to report critically of the Contras. It was Ronald Reagan's pet initiative. The president had described the Contras as the moral equals of the founding fathers, if you remember. So whenever any negative publicity came out, there were teams set up at the State Department, inside the NSC, who would go and browbeat editors, browbeat correspondents. There was a case with the National Public Radio when NPR put out a show about a Contra massacre of some farm workers. And the story was entirely accurate, but it led to a trip by the public diplomacy team headed by Otto Reich at that point over to NPR offices, and they sat down and basically browbeat members of the NPR staff over there. And because the government had some control over the NPR funding, the foreign editor, who was then Paul Allen, was ousted. People were losing jobs over their efforts to tell the truth about these issues, and that has a very telling effect on any community. And the Washington Press Corps is a relatively small community. So when you start seeing that happen, and with the level of nasty attacks that were being directed from the conservative media, particularly against individual reporters, from the Washington Times, from the New Republic, from the Wall Street Journal editorial page, et cetera, it became very hard to sustain serious and hard-hitting investigations of the Contras. And people stopped. And having stopped, or having been purged from the process, that left behind those who had actually survived because they had not done their jobs. And we ended up seeing this, among other stories, being falling through the cracks.
So, in essence, you're saying that the government is essentially promoting people in the news media by favoring them and demoting people by disfavoring them.
Well, it's not quite that simple. I mean, but it's to understand how Washington journalism works these days. It's a bit like that kids game laser tag. And if that's where you have like a gun that shoots light, and you have like a sensor on your chest, and you can get hit once or twice or a few times, but at a certain point, the buzzers go off and you're dead. Well, that's a bit like how it is. And now when you have all these groups, Accuracy in Media, Brent Bazell's group, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, American Spectator, just literally scores of conservative publications, when a reporter would write critically about the Contras, that reporter would come under fierce attack. And after a while, his editors would say, hey, listen, this isn't worth it. We're taking too many hits. And people would stop, or if they didn't stop, they wouldn't work anymore.
Let me remind the audience again, if I may, that I'm speaking with Robert Parry, who is the editor of the Consortium for Independent Journalism. He was formerly with the Associated Press from 1974 to 1985, with Newsweek from 1987 to 90, and he's also now working for the Nation magazine's investigative unit. He's the head of that, and we're talking about going back to the sort of the genesis of the story of the Iran Contra story in the press and its evolution into this news story about the Contra-cocaine connection into South Central Los Angeles. And there's no question in my mind, Robert Parry, about your assertion that the Reagan administration had a highly sophisticated damage control team out there operating under the aegis of public diplomacy. In fact, my former partner in this radio program, who was previously the head of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, he went to the State Department in that period as a Deputy Undersecretary of State, and that was his job, and he quit because he couldn't stand, literally couldn't live with himself, lying about the Contras. So there's no question about that. It's just it's the other part of it that I'm trying to pin down is the extent to which
it worked. I mean, I would say, and this may differ from what people in the operation may have felt, but the public diplomacy operation was highly successful.
Right.
And it was highly successful because it isolated the handful of reporters who were trying to tell the truth about this area.
Right.
And subjected them to a lot of attack.
Let me ask you, though, about when you originally broke the Ollie North Iran Contra story, you had a hard time getting that one out. It sort of slipped out by mistake, didn't it?
No, of course, all these stories were very hard because there were only a few organizations really pushing them. The Associated Press, where I was doing a lot of it because I was leading that investigation. The Miami Herald was doing some very good work, but the big papers were just avoiding this, and that some of that goes back to the experience of Raymond Bonner, who was a New York Times correspondent in Central America, who was targeted for his reporting about death squads in El Salvador, and he was run out of the New York Times, and that sent a chilling message right through the press corps. So by the time we got to the 84-85 period, when I was looking at Oliver North's operation, the news executives knew this was a dangerous area to go into. But I must say, we were able to push out very careful stories about Oliver North. Then when we got to the contra-drug allegations, which we encountered in the fall of 85, Brian Barger and I did go down to Miami and then down to Central America to investigate this and came back with the story. We had information from the Contras, from their backers, from DEA officials. We had some documentation from Central America. We had a good deal of information already, and it was a solid story at that point. But when and it went through the editing process at the AP and was cleared for approval, we thought. So when I sent it in to the general desk in Washington, it popped up on the computer for the bureau chief. And he took it into his office and made a final call to New York, where AP is run. And there were suddenly cold feet, and he called me in and said, "Well, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do this. You'll have to, do a lot more reporting and so forth and so on." However, simultaneously, the story had also shown up on the computer for the foreign desk, which is another branch of the AP, and they were not aware of the political problems that were developing around the story. So they simply translated the story into Spanish and moved it out on the Spanish language wire. So a couple of days later, someone called Brian Barger, who was standing next to me, and saying, "Gee, it was a great story you guys had on contra-drugs." And Barger just went very pale and said, "What are you talking about?" And it turned out that we discovered that there'd been this, in a sense, a mistake made. And then AP had us redouble our efforts, and I think the next day we ran the story out on the national wires for the AP.
Let me just remind the audience again, if I may, that I'm speaking with Robert Parry, who is the editor of the Consortium for Independent Journalism. He broke the original Iran Contra story when he was working for the Associated Press back in 1985, and he's subsequently worked for Newsweek, and he's now with the Nation magazine's investigative unit. And we're talking about the story that won't go away, although there does seem to be a considerable constituency that would wish it go away. It's interesting, our previous guest, Harlan Braun, basically thinks the government is really going to be eventually embarrassed by this, and by this drip of information, and by these denials that they're making it actually worse. So he made the analogy with the Gulf War veterans, how the government denied there were any problems, and of course, subsequent to that, they've had to admit there's a lot more people affected, and now they're admitting, in fact, that the pages of field reports from those particular days when the Iraqi bunkers were blown up have gone missing. But he also, Robert Parry, brought out something that I thought was pretty extraordinary, and he thought was a much harder lead for a journalist to follow up on, and that is that the sheriff's unit out here that raided Blandon's house and other houses, And of course, the FBI reports on those raids became the first lead, I think, or one of the substantial leads that Gary Webb got when he got a Freedom of Information search back. He said that these sheriffs, who were his clients, they were skimming, there's no question about that. He said, but they basically confiscated $60 million here locally, and he says in court testimony that that money was supposedly wired back to the drug cartels, and he feels that somebody ought to look into whether, in fact, that confiscated money went into the U.S. Treasury or went somewhere else.
Well, it sounds like an interesting story. I think there are a lot of interesting leads on this. The problem has been that the atmosphere in which they're pursued is so poisonous, it's especially in Washington. And I think people outside of Washington do not quite grasp how nasty the city can be on stories like this. I was just going back. I was on the West Coast, as you know, for a few days last week, and I'd come back and flipping through some of the Washington Post and New York Times I had stored up here. And there was a piece in the Washington Post style section, which is sort of the chic section, which sort of helps set the pecking order in Washington. And there was a long piece about bad information and how dangerous that is. And it included Gary Webb's story as a good example of bad information that we must protect ourselves from. And it was all done in this kind of ridiculing tone, which is very intimidating for people in Washington. No one wants to be laughed at in a place like this. So it's very hard to get editors to pursue it, and it's very hard, I think, even in Congress, for Congress people to put their careers on the line and risk being made fools out of. So people haven't pursued it for those kinds of reasons, I think, as much as any other. Obviously, the people in the government that want to keep these things secret try to encourage those attitudes and that fear, but it's how it works.
What about Larry Combast, the new Republican head of the House Select Committee on Intelligence? He's the fellow that these 3,500 pages of documents apparently have been sent to by Sheriff Block, and just on December the 3rd, State Senator Tom Hayden wrote Sherman Block a letter, for which he's expecting a reply this coming week, urging him to hand these pages over to the public. But if they're going to Larry Combast, he's just he, along with the CIA, have fired or have removed the clearance of a State Department officer, Frank Nunzio, and for telling the truth to the Congress. I mean, I find it extraordinary that a member of the United States Congress is punishing a member of the government for telling them the truth and going along with the agency. I mean, the fact that Nuncio's career would be ruined without a clearance gives you an idea of how this game is played. Clearly, the CIA has a lot more power than people think in Washington, simply because it's the lure of being in the know, obviously. If congressmen want to be nice to them because they don't want to be cut off, and if government employees can't function without access to their information, that would indicate to me that they've got some power. And I guess for reporters, it's even more obvious. If they can be fed stuff, they can make their careers, right? Right.
Well, in the case of Nunzio, who was a State Department official who blew the whistle on the Guatemalan death squad activity, which the CIA had known about and had been lying to Congress about what it knew, Nunzio told a member of Congress that he was being misled, and that member of Congress, Bob Torricelli, then went public with some of this information. But the guy who gets really nailed for this is Nunzio, and what the message that sends, and Washington's, as I say, is a fairly small, tight community. The message that sends is that if you're a State Department official wanting to sort of blow the whistle on some lying and deception, you do so at the risk of your entire career, your ability to support your family. And journalists have learned pretty much the same thing, that if they get targeted by in this case, the allies of the Reagan-Bush administrations, who are particularly rough when they come after you with all kinds of smear campaigns, pretty soon you can't work in this town. There's sort of an informal blacklist almost. So people are aware of that. They're aware of it as anyone's aware of how organizations really function internally as opposed to maybe how they supposedly function on the outside. There's that knowledge of what's dangerous, what hurts your career, and it's clear to people that trying to take on the CIA over allegations like these drug trafficking allegations by the Contras is extremely hazardous to your career health. If you remember, when Senator John Kerry did a very good investigation, that investigation not only exposed the Contra drug trafficking, but it zeroed in on Manuel Noriega. This was back in '89, before our invasion of Panama. It also opened the door into the BCCI scandal. It was a very important investigation. When it came out as a report in April of '89, the Washington Post buried it on page 820 in a dismissive 700-word article by Mike Isikoff. That was the treatment it received in general. At Newsweek, John Kerry was labeled a Randy conspiracy buff. This is the kind of tone and treatment that people get when they try to dig out the truth. And so after a while, people realize, hey, this is awfully dangerous. And if I want to watch out for my career and making a decent living, I better not get into those areas. And I think that explains a lot of why the Washington Press Corps has attacked so harshly the San Jose Mercury piece and Gary Webb personally.
Even though nobody's actually, I mean, obviously it's easy to refute the thesis that the CIA peddled drugs on street corners in South Central.
Right, which of course the San Jose Mercury News never said. But an awful lot of what we're seeing here is, and this was repeated in this foul section piece I mentioned, it's this, well, the San Jose Mercury News implied that the CIA peddled drugs on street corners, and that's so laughable. And so what the media has been doing has been setting up straw men in terms of pretending to say what the San Jose Mercury didn't say, and then bashing the heck out of that straw man. So I guess I was a bit surprised, going back to your earlier point about will this, in a way, come out now. I was a bit surprised at the intensity of the Washington news media's defense of the Contras over the drug trafficking. Even though if you read those stories closely, now the Washington Post and other publications are saying, well, yes, the Contras were involved in drug trafficking in the 1980s, but the San Jose Mercury piece was overstated. That's kind of basically the bottom line of what they say. That then gets interpreted to being that, this story's been debunked. And that has been so strong a message that it's going to be very hard, I think, for members of Congress, for people from California or from the Washington area or for anyone outside the government and outside the media to really demand clear, firm answers to these issues. I think it's possible, and I think it certainly would be a positive trend if that kind of public pressure forced a final admission, at least a partial admission, of what's been going on for the last 10 years and what's been covered up for that long.
Well, I think it also indicates, at least to me, Robert Parry, a broader issue, and that is the extent to which the mainstream powerful press, the press that shapes opinions, that's the Times, the Post and the LA Times, perhaps have gotten too comfortable with the government over the years, which certainly for a conservative is appalling. I mean, that's why I find people like Larry Cumbas to be so despicable, because of the conservative Republican rhetoric about getting big government off your back. I mean, here he is bending over for the government. So my sense is that you have to just say thank God for the internet, because it's so pervasive and so free that it's an alternative. I think that it's not surprising. I don't know whether you've read Jim Fallow's book about the press, but I've spoken to him a few times about it. He certainly didn't win any friends in Washington. I mean, he was making a slightly different thesis, and that is, that these big successful journalists have been essentially become corrupt, and here you have Cokie Roberts getting huge lecture fees from the medical industry while she's supposedly covering medical questions, etc.
Well, I certainly agree with those points too. I think the news media in Washington has become corrupt, and it's become corrupt in a variety of ways, and also it's become so entrenched and so powerful. People do not get voted out of office from the media. So you have your Sam Donaldsons and Cokie Roberts and George Wills. Take it from the various sides of the permitted political spectrum here in Washington. They all hang around and they make lots of money giving these speeches. So I wouldn't dispute what Jim Fallows says about that. I agree with it. But there's also a more subtle, if you will, way in which this works, and that is that there can be such pressure placed through personal ridicule and attack on individual reporters that they stop doing their jobs or are unable to do their jobs. And I think that was particularly a problem when Ronald Reagan tried to protect the Contras through the public diplomacy and other such efforts. And it raises questions about can a conservative-dominated House of Representatives, and for that matter, Senate now, can it take an honest look at the Contras? Because to look at the Contras honestly and to really expose what they did would also undermine Ronald Reagan's legacy, which is, if you watched the Republican convention in San Diego, the Reagan legacy was a major part of what the Republicans feel about themselves. Reagan was much more of a star than say George Bush, who had a fairly much a cameo appearance. So to take on an issue that might put that legacy in a bad light is very hard for conservative Republicans.
I suppose it's with your wife Nancy Reagan running around saying "just say no," and if history, the worm of history turns and it indicates that President Reagan may have created the conditions in which the CIA turned a blind eye to contra-drug dealing. I suppose that is worse than Jack Kennedy being found out to have a active extracurricular sex life.
Well, right, and I think the Republicans probably have seen the effect on the Democrats from having the Kennedy myth crumble, and I think they don't want that to happen with the sort of a legend of their modern legend of political life, Ronald Reagan.
Well, I thank you very much for joining us in Los Angeles, Robert Parry, and I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you.
Bye. Hello again, I'm Ian Masters. I was just speaking then with Robert Parry, who's the editor of the Consortium for Independent Journalism, and he broke the original Iran Contra story for the Associated Press back in 1985. Madeline Schwab is the board operator. Thank you very much, Madeline. This program is heard live every Sunday at 11. It's rebroadcast on Monday at 2 p.m. I'll be back again next Sunday at 11. Have a very pleasant week. Bye.